Hydrophobic Garden. Part 1, Sanity, a Luxury. In the trenches, water learned to scream. Dmitri first noticed it on a Tuesday that had forgotten its name. The way droplets from his canteen would shriek as they fell, tiny voices cascading through the air before disappearing into the mud. He mentioned it to no one. The war had taught them all that sanity was a luxury, like soap or silence, and reporting hallucinations would only get you rotated to the rear, where different kinds of death waited in antiseptic rooms. The cat arrived on a Wednesday that might have been Thursday. It materialized from the smoke like all creatures did now, as if the earth itself was exhaling ghosts. Gray fur, matted with substances that predated language. Eyes the color of forgetting. It mewed, or perhaps the sound came from somewhere deeper, from the soil, from the bones of houses that had been houses once. "Don't," said Pavlo, his voice a thread pulled from a larger unraveling. But Dmitri had already extended his hand. The war had made them all hungry for anything that remembered being alive before the world learned to fragment. The bite was small, a punctuation mark, a period where there should have been a comma, suggesting the sentence was ending when it had only begun to transform. Part 2, Divorced from Consequence. 3 weeks later, Dmitri stood before a puddle that contained an entire alternative history of water. In this history, H2O had never learned to nurture, had only ever known how to drown. The puddle rippled though there was no wind, and in its surface, he saw not his reflection, but a photographic negative of himself, white where he was dark, dark where he was light, terrified where he felt calm. "You should drink," Pavlo said, but his voice came from yesterday. "I should," Dmitri agreed from tomorrow. The fox appeared at the perimeter that night, or perhaps it had always been there, and they were only now learning to see it. Corporal Yuchenko tried to shoot it, but his bullets transformed into moths mid-flight, settling on the animals, fur like metals for campaigns fought in dreams. The fox spoke in rabies, a language composed entirely of verbs, with no subjects to perform them and no objects to receive them. Biting, frothing, convulsing, pure action divorced from consequence. "The animals are migrating," said the medic, whose name was either Oksana or tomorrow or the space between heartbeats. From the combat zones, they carry the old gods with them. "Which gods?" someone asked. "The ones that predate mercy." Part 3, a probability cloud. The treatment center existed in a probability cloud, sometimes 20 kilometers away, sometimes in another dimension entirely. Evacuating the wounded had become a form of quantum mechanics. You could know where the ambulance was or how fast it was traveling, but never both. Drones circled overhead like mechanical angels, sent to document the apocalypse in real time. Their cameras capturing footage that would be studied by future archaeologists trying to understand when exactly the human project had admitted defeat. Dmitri's hands began to shake on day 27. Or perhaps they had always been shaking, and he was only now noticing through the specific clarity that comes from a virus rewriting your neural pathways into poetry. A bat swooped through the bunker, which was impossible because the bunker was underground, which meant either the bat had learned to walk or the definitions of up and down had finally surrendered to the general chaos. I need the vaccine, Dmitri told Oksana / tomorrow / the space between heartbeats. The vaccine is a fairy tale, she replied. Like peace, like next week, like the concept of tomorrow occurring in a linear fashion. He tried to remember the protocol. Wash the wound with soap for 10 minutes. But which 10 minutes? The ones that had already passed, the ones currently passing, the ones waiting in the future like landmines. Time had become unreliable, another casualty of the war, another system collapsing under the weight of its own obsolescence. Part 4, Becoming Metaphors. The veterinarians without borders had established a clinic in the village that used to be a village, where they vaccinated animals against becoming metaphors. A dog lined up, then a cat, then a wolf, then a soldier who had forgotten the distinction. They all opened their mouths to receive the sacrament, the biological grace that might prevent their saliva from becoming a transmission vector for the apocalypse. 58,000 bites a year, the veterinarian explained, though her words emerged as a flock of starlings that immediately migrated south. Most receive treatment. Most survive. But the war has interrupted the meaning of most, has created exceptions that swallow the rule. Dmitri watched a raccoon receive its vaccine. The animal's eyes held that specific wisdom that comes from being both wild and displaced, from having your home destroyed and being forced to rebuild in the wreckage of someone else's former life. The raccoon looked at Dmitri, and he understood. They were the same species now, both infected by proximity, both carrying something that wanted only to replicate, to spread, to transform the world into more of itself. At night, he heard the foxes singing. The oral vaccination campaigns had stopped. How do you vaccinate a landscape that's actively trying to kill you? And the foxes had noticed. They gathered in packs that operated according to dream logic, appearing in multiple locations simultaneously, their rabid songs a harmony that predated music. Part 5. Water rose up in rebellion. On day 33, Dmitri tried to drink from his canteen, and the water rose up in rebellion. It climbed out of the container like a prisoner escaping, formed itself into a trembling sphere that hovered between his face and his fear, reflecting distorted versions of both. Hydrophobia, the medic had called it, from the Greek, hydro, water, and phobos, fear. But Dmitri understood it differently now. It wasn't that he feared water. It was that water feared him, feared what he was becoming, feared the virus that was teaching his cells a new language, one where reproduction meant death and transmission meant love. Pavlo found him convulsing in the corner where corners used to be. Before geometry admitted it had no answers. How long? Pavlo asked. Since the bite, forever. Since forever, the bite. That's not what I meant. I know, but it's the answer anyway. The trench pet program had seemed humanitarian once. Allow soldiers to adopt strays, to maintain some connection to the domestic world that was rapidly being mythologized into non-existence. But the pets carried more than fleas. They carried the virus, yes, but also the memory of a world where bites were accidents, where scratches were mistakes, where violence wasn't the primary method of communication between species. Part 6, the golden hour. The golden hour shattered into golden minutes, then golden seconds, then finally into a golden instant, so brief it could only be perceived in retrospect, after it had already passed and taken your survival with it. Dmitri understood that he had missed it, the window for treatment, the moment when the vaccine might have intercepted the virus's narrative arc and rewritten the ending. But the drones circled, and the shells fell, and the ambulance existed in a state of perpetual almost arrival, forever approaching but never reaching. In his fever dreams, or perhaps his waking life, had become the dream, and his dreams the only remaining truth. Dmitri saw the statistics transform into animals. 2 deaths became 2 wolves. 58,000 bites became 58,000 mouths opening in unison. A choir of broken skin and compromised flesh, singing the anthem of a nation held together by wounds. Once symptoms appear, Oksana/tomorrow/ the space between heartbeats explained, though she might have been explaining it to herself, or to the air, or to the concept of future tense. The disease is almost 100% fatal. Almost. We cling to that almost the way we cling to other impossible things, like the war ending, like going home, like home still existing when we get there. The cat appeared again, or perhaps it had never left, had simply been occupying the space between visibility and its opposite. Gray fur, matted with the same substances, now multiplied. Eyes the color of advanced forgetting. It regarded Dmitri with something that might have been recognition, or might have been hunger, or might have been the virus itself, achieving consciousness through the biological machinery of a feline host. Part 7, hieroglyphics written in convulsions. By day 40, Dmitri had become a lesson. Soldiers gathered around him in the bunker, maintaining distance. Now, distance being the new form of affection, and watched the transformation. This was education through witness. This was prevention through spectacle. His muscles contracted in patterns that suggested meaning, hieroglyphics written in convulsions, each spasm a word in a language that could only be read by the dying. Soap, he tried to say, remembering the protocol. Wash the wound with soap for 10 minutes, but the words emerged as foam, white and desperate. The body's final attempt at chemistry, at using bubbles to create a barrier between self and non-self, though that distinction had long since dissolved. The footage would circulate later, aftermath disguised as current events, past tense pretending to be present continuous. A Ukrainian soldier in his 30s, suffering. The internet would watch and scroll and watch again, turning tragedy into content, into data points into evidence of the general deterioration. He would die shortly after, but shortly is a relative term. In one timeline, he was already dead. In another, he had never been bitten. In this timeline, the only one that mattered because it was the only one that was happening. He existed in the eternal present tense of suffering, the place where all soldiers eventually congregate. Part 8, Geography into Nightmare. Pavlo held his hand, gloved now. Protection against transmission, against metaphor becoming literal. Tell me about water, Pavlo said, before. Before water was, Dimitri's throat closed around the memory. Water was possible. Outside, the war continued its patient work of transforming geography into nightmare, coordinates into elegies. The displaced animals moved through the ruins, carrying the virus, carrying their own displacement, carrying the question that nobody could answer. What does it mean to go feral when civilization itself has forgotten how to be domestic? The vaccine exists, Dimitri thought, or tried to think, but thoughts were becoming difficult. Language fragmenting into its component parts, phonemes scattering like shrapnel, syntax surrendering to pure feeling. The vaccine exists somewhere in the space between bite and symptom, in that golden hour that collapses under its own weight, in that perfect condition where prevention meets possibility. But here, in the trenches where water had learned to scream, where animals migrated not north or south, but sideways through reality itself, where the virus wrote its poetry directly onto neural tissue here, the vaccine was a fairy tale. And fairy tales, Dimitri remembered from before, always ended with transformation. The princess becomes a swan. The prince becomes a frog. The soldier becomes a statistic. The cat watched from the corner that contained all corners. Dimitri closed his eyes, which wasn't the same as sleep, but wasn't entirely different either. In the distance, or perhaps in his mind, or perhaps in the space where those two territories had merged and become indistinguishable, the foxes began their singing. Their rabid, beautiful, impossible song, an anthem for the displaced, a hymn for the infected, a lullaby for a world that had forgotten how to cure anything except itself of hope. The gray cat purred. Outside, water continued learning how to scream. And somewhere, always somewhere, another soldier reached out to pet another stray. The cycle, like the war, like the virus, like all beautiful, terrible things, continued.